in my previous district. Participating in very similar ally academies in Shorewood. So we experienced all 4 of those sessions last year. So really just looking forward to continuing my learning and engaging with all of you as we're moving forward. So thank you very much, and great to see everybody.
So I just want to say a quick hello. I'm Elise Fatura and very happy to be here. Thank you, Kim and Brian. So we're really looking forward. We're going to go back a little bit to go forward, and Nassif is going to start us out because it's been, our last time together was May. So it's been a few months. And so I'm going to go ahead and hand this baton to Nassif, and he'll get us started out. Nice to see everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Elise. And thank you, Kim and Brian, for the intro. And hello and good evening, everybody. Good to be with you this evening. Good to see some familiar faces again and some names, and really excited about our 3rd installment of the Community Equity Ally Academies that Oshkosh coordinated and put this together for the community. So really appreciative to be here with you all tonight. As Elise stated, that we will use first part of our time to do a review of where we were before, because we last chatted with one another in May, but it seems like eons ago. So we're going to go back and review some of the learning and some of the material that we covered, and then use that to launch us into a couple of quick discussions and then into our new learning for tonight. So Elise, if you could go to the next slide, and then we can remind everyone of our community agreements when we engage in this work. And so we used what Glenn Singleton uses from Courageous Conversations. And the first one is to experience discomfort. There's no way we're going to get around that. And actually, we want discomfort because we need to lean into that. And when we lean into the discomfort, it means we're growing and learning and building relational capacity with one another. The second agreement is to stay engaged. Third, to speak your truth. What's your experience? What have you observed? What do your kids tell you? What do your community neighbors tell you? And then expect and accept non-closure. And then additionally, the next agreement is, when we're engaging in this work, when we're learning together, when we're having discourse and dialogue about some of the experiences we've had, what we think we knew, and how things are changing. There's no blame, shame, or judgment here. Next is that equity work is lifelong and it's never ending at the individual level, and then also at the organizational and social and community level as well. And then the ultimate goal of all of this is just making sure that we're building collective equity capacity. No one person can do this on their own. Not Dr. Davis, not Dr. Brown, not Elise or myself. It takes all of us to really engage in this work together and to understand how we need to challenge and grow and support one another as we try to figure out what it is that we need to do and do what's best for kids. And then lastly, make sure we're welcoming and inclusive and that we're actually listening. We're engaging in empathetic listening, extending our ears, as we would say in elementary school, to our neighbors. And then if we are using education jargon, please tell us to stop, because we want to make sure that we are using language that everyone has access to. And in education, the nomenclature, the words that we use and the acronyms can sometimes seems like we're throwing alphabet soup up against the wall. So if we are using language and acronyms that don't make sense or that you haven't heard before, don't hesitate to interrupt us, raise your hand or in chat and let us know, hey, can you explain that a little bit more? Can you take a step back and explain this in a different way? So those are the agreements for tonight. And then in terms of logistics, we're here from 6 until 8:30. And if you remember the last 2 times, that time flew by quickly, which is a good indicator that we were doing some good work together and learning and engaging in some really deep discussions. We'll have our first break at 7:15 until 7:30. We'll take a 15-minute break at that point, and then we'll bring it home after that. And then in terms of our time together on Zoom, we're going to do a mix of whole group and small group learning. The time that we have together in small groups will depend on the activity. And so when we are in small groups, the groups will be timed. A lot of our time frame for those groups will be anywhere from 8 minutes to 12 minutes or so, but you'll have a timer at the top of your screen. And then we'll give you a 60-second warning to let you know to finish up that point of the conversation and be prepared to come back to a larger group setting. Let Zoom move you back to the main group as opposed to moving yourselves. And then use the chat box feature for questions that you might have. And it's good for us to keep those questions in the chat because we can download the chat and keep track of the questions that you all might have in case we need to follow up with more information for you. And then we'll be using the circle, as you see here down below this last statement, as an indicator that it is group time. So use that as your cue to get ready to have Scotty beam you up into the atmosphere somewhere for your group discussion. And then just not a preview, but a review of the purpose of this, and then also what we've done so far. The first goal was to learn about Oshkosh's equity work. The things that they've been engaged in quite intensely in the last few years, and to learn more about the strides that they need to make and where it is that we want to go. Secondly, is to learn how to support the district's effort as an ally. Understanding your role and responsibility, understanding entry points and access points for you, and how you could be a good partner for schools, for principals, for the district, and most importantly, for our kids. And then third is to learn how to advance equity work in your own community spaces, whether it's home, in your neighborhood, at work, at church, or your place of worship, in the community, anywhere that you have a significant touch point with neighbors and other people in community. And then in terms of what we've covered so far, and we'll go into more detail, but our first session was way back when, in March 9th, I think we had quite a bit of snow on the ground. But we talked about the purpose and outcomes of the Academy. We talked about the importance of participating in all 4 sessions as best as you can, an overview of the framework and process. And then we took a really deep dive into the history of marginalization and our current structures that work to maintain some of that marginalization that we see today. In the second session on May 5th, we may have had snow on the ground still, but we were working to shift from deficit to asset-based perspectives. And so I believe we spent this significant, I think all of our time on this particular part of our learning, where we just talked about stereotype threat and some of the work of the scholars that we use, and we'll do a review of that. And then tonight, what we're hoping to do is to review quickly as possible sessions 1 and 2, and dive deeply into the third module of the work that the schools are engaged in, which is identity development for equity systems change. And then hopefully do an entry point into the fourth module and a quick overview there of the equity research that undergirds a lot of what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And then in December, when we return, and we know there will be snow on the ground, equity non-negotiables will be covered, the equity audit itself, what that is, why schools are engaging in equity audit, and then shifting from what we normally do in terms of educating and collaborating to what we call our C3 teams, co-planning, co-serving, and co-learning. And we'll explain that in more detail in a couple months. But just to give you an idea of where we're going. And then thinking more deeply about how we support the Oshkosh Area School District as community teams and members, and then applying the ICS learnings in all of our spaces so that the onus for community change and for equity work to gain traction isn't solely on the school district, but everyone who's a stakeholder in the school district, and in transferring that learning and that information and that work to their specific community spaces as well.
So am I taking this or you?
Yep, this is you.
Little reminder here. So we wanted to start where we left off with your resonates and pauses, and we'll do that again tonight. You know, we did that after both sessions. And so what we'd like to do right now is just give you just a minute to read. These are the resonates from our May time together, where we went over asset versus deficit-based language, as Nassif just spoke about. So let's just take about a minute and we can review these. And then if anybody has any comments, they're welcome to make them. So we'll continue to, as Nassif said, we're going to continue to build on asset versus deficit-based language, and we'll do that tonight. And here are some pauses. What gave you pause? So then when we revisit module 2, there are a few questions in here, like how to interrupt deficit-based language when we see it, calling people in and out. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when Nassif gets to module 2. And then just some questions about how educators are experiencing this as well. Because remember, this is a shift for everyone. And we're all shifting going forward of really looking at the funds of knowledge and assets that families bring to the table. And again, Nassif will dig deeper into that for us. So we will have the same Google survey available and ask you to fill it out again. So I'm going to do just a quick review of the history of marginalization for a couple of reasons. You know, it is the why behind the what. It shifts us from blaming kids and families to seeing how the institution has been complicit and creating spaces that can be marginalizing. So we know that oppression and marginalization is historical, structural, cultural, and systemic, which is why we do this system work, right? And that's, so we started out with the history of marginalization, and I'll just do a real brief discussion about it. So we talked about schools have a culture of marginalization by race, disability, language, social class, religion, gender, sexual gender identity, and all their intersections. And what we talked about was the fact is every suburban, rural, and urban school district experiences this, which is why we have to go back to the history of how schools were set up, because if this would not occur within an institution unless it was actually structured that way. So when we look back at how schools were set up, we talked about that school districts were normed on a population of students that were white, predominantly male, middle class to affluent. And when kids weren't successful, the student failed and the system continued. And so that's what's really important to hold on to, because one of those primary things that occurred was the child failed, and we saw the child as not successful. We saw the child as the challenge versus the system adapting to meet a broader range of needs of students. When compulsory ed came in, the more diverse our school districts became, the more segregated we set up practices by race, disability, class, language, and gender. And so that was pretty clear across the country. And then as we continued, even when we intentionally worked towards interrupting practices of marginalization and segregation, we saw that they popped up in other more covert forms, like low ability grouping, track classrooms, programs, right? Programs that we created non-discrimination. So the same type of situation continued to occur. Number one, the more diverse we became, the more we actually responded in the educational institution by segregated practices and seeing the child as a problem versus the system. The other thing we did is, so we acknowledged that, and this is historical as educators, we acknowledged that when kids weren't successful, we needed something different, right? And so there were many class action lawsuits that had ended up setting up many services in schools, special ed, Title I, at risk, our alcohol and drug programs, ELL programs was part of the Lau case. So we had many class action lawsuits that led to non-discrimination regulations to actually make sure that all kids were educated equitably. The problem was we put them on the outside of our circle. So we maintained this normative, predominantly white, cisgender, able-bodied, middle class, and English speaking. And when kids didn't assimilate to that and needed other services, we didn't actually put them inside the core of teaching and learning. We usually responded again with seeing the child as needing to be fixed and responded through segregated practices. And then we kept on adding them, right? And then we've continued to add them. So the work that Oshkosh has done is really look at all these programs, because when we think of who's in these programs, kids that are predominantly experiencing poverty, kids that are brown or Black, kids that are linguistically diverse, kids that have been identified with a disability. So kids that we're looking at under Title I services, which is around reading and math. And so we've created all these programs where we actually place kids in order to help. But what we found is our data isn't helping. And so we talked about that when we were together, because a couple reasons. One, historically, as I said, we've seen the child or the student is broken, not the system. And the more diverse, we responded by segregation. And when you respond with segregation, it places the onus of responsibility on the child and the family versus the system. What also happens is all students don't get the same high quality teaching and learning. So what we talked about within our system is how the schools drew their current models of what happens when kids aren't successful. And this is the core. And then when kids aren't successful, where do they go? And what do we do? And then we gave some examples of often what happens is when kids are removed from the core of teaching and learning, they miss instruction, right? But we also assess them on that instruction, right? We assess them and expect them to know it. They don't do as well. We often remove them again for remediation or additional instruction. And so again, we're putting it on the backs of students to actually take that information, bring it back to the core of teaching and learning. And so we talked about that when we were together, that results often in a stereotype threat or stereotype lift. And so some of your resonates from our first time together was really about stereotype threats and stereotype lifts, because most of us have experienced a stereotype threat in one situation or another. And so a stereotype threat is when we're reminded of an identity that actually is marginalizing to us. And it can be by race or social class or ethnicity or language or ability or gender or sexuality or any of those intersections. And what often happens is when we're reminded of that identity, our performance is harmed. We do less well. We do less well. And so what it does is create a stereotype threat. So what we talked about in this previous picture was that when students were removed, the students that are removed from the core of teaching and learning experience a stereotype threat. We're removing them to help them, right? It's good intent, but they receive a stereotype threat, so they often do less well. The kids that remain behind actually get what Claude still causes a stereotype lift. They actually do better, which makes a lot of sense. So if we think about our own experiences, if someone else is needing more help than I'm needing, I'm going to feel better about myself, right? It's going to give me more confidence. I'm going to do better, because we also know the more confident we are, the more capable, right? We believe we are, the more capable of a learner we are. The more we learn, the more we know, the better we do, right? But if we experience that stereotype threat, we do not see ourselves as a capable learner. And we actually may be experiencing moments of embarrassment for our identity. And so often what happens, and you can see in this situation, that students were removed, and some of it was for disability, but also they have other identities by race. And so the majority of students removed were students of color. And so again, maintaining that normative of predominantly white, cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class English speaking within our schools. And so that in and of itself perpetuates inequities. And so what we talked about was a situation like this, what it ends up doing is blames and labels the student. We remove them from the normative. And so we reinforce a normative that actually doesn't represent who we are. So that language around normative is just saying who we see as our capable core set of learners and who we don't see as our capable core set of learners, causing a stereotype threat and lift, requiring students who need the most comprehensive education to actually receive the most fragmented education. And for students to actually synthesize, the students who need the most cohesive education are asked to synthesize their experiences and information from a range of different adults and a range of different locations back to the core of teaching and learning, all while maintaining this reactionary cycle. And so the results of all of it is we continue the achievement and access gaps. We label more students. We increase in grouping by perceived ability, which causes a stereotype threat. We increase our track. So we respond still trying to fix that student, which is exactly what we did about 400 years ago. So our first schools were in 1632, so just under 400 years. So we have, we have a few centuries of these practices of seeing something wrong with the child, and then we need to fix the child versus creating a much more diverse normative. So we're going to ask you to go back into your small groups. And at that time, the first time we got together on this work, is we asked you to talk about your own experiences related to separate programs, groupings, and other experiences. This time, we're going to ask you to take it to the next level of who was marginalized, how were social dynamics impacted by these practices, and what messages were internalized by those of us who were marginalized in school. So we're going to ask you to continue on these conversations. Now, obviously, you're going to be in different groups, but just thinking about your own experiences related to separate programs, grouping, and other experiences. So you might have been in the low reading group, right? You may have been in an accelerated reading group. We had someone share with us who was African-American that they were in an accelerated reading group and realized they were the only one who identified as African-American in an accelerated reading group. And when she looked back, she realized that where were the rest of the kids, right? So very personal experiences about your own education, and then really thinking about who else was marginalized, right? Where were they? Where were kids with disabilities, right? Where were kids who were linguistically diverse? So we're going to ask you to think about who was marginalized and how were social dynamics impacted by those practices. Did kids spend time with each other? Were there friendships across different groups of kids and different identities? But what were the social dynamics there? And then what messages were internalized by those who were marginalized? Any questions on that? Nassif, do you want to add anything?
No, I think we're good to go.
All right, so I'm going to put you in groups. I think a couple of things we'd like you to do when you get into groups is, first of all, introduce yourselves to each other. since it's been, I don't know, how long is it? 5 months, 6 months? It goes so fast. This summer was just a blur, wasn't it? All right. So we want you to introduce yourselves and then really take some time thinking about maybe what you shared with the group last time, and then go deeper into these questions. I'm wondering if those of you who know how to take a screenshot, you may take a screenshot of these questions so you have them. I'm trying to remember how to take a screenshot. Is it Command-Shift-4?
Yes.
Yes.
You know, you can't, I know it by my hands doing it, but that's all. But if they're not doing it, I don't know it. All right. And we'll also make sure you have access to this PowerPoint too. So you won't have to do this all night. All right. So I'm going to go ahead, open rooms. You're in groups of 3 or 4. And I'm thinking about 12 minutes. So you really have some time to have some healthy conversations. And then we'll be slipping in and out of rooms just to see if you need anything. You can always request help from the host. Thank you, Nassif, for putting the questions in chat. Here we go. Just remember what Nassif said, that the system should move you right in and will bring you right back when time is up. So you shouldn't have to do anything, but I'll stay in the main room in case anybody gets stuck.
All right, folks. So thank you for engaging in the first discussion and also introducing yourselves to one another and rebuilding that community that we had the last couple of times. So thank you for doing that. The next thing we'll review is step 2 in the work of Cornerstone 1, which is a shift from deficit-based thinking practices and language to asset-based thinking, language, and practices. And so just an overview of the key learning from that particular module was understanding the why behind shifting from a deficit-based perspective to an asset-based perspective, using person-first, asset-based inclusive language when we're talking about kids, when we're talking about families and caregivers, reflecting on deficit-based language and ideology in our settings, and auditing our settings too, to realize where these deficit-based practices and structures are present and what we may need to do to dismantle those particular structures and practices. And then we took the particular lens of poverty and practiced asset-based perspective language and thinking with that particular lens of identity, and really discussed how, particular when you shift your lens from a deficit to an asset-based perspective, you start to really see the gifts and the talents and the benefits and see people in a different light. And in terms of the deficit perspective and ideology, we grounded our learning around Richard Valencia's work and having him talk about deficit ideology as a worldview that really explains and justifies outcome inequalities, and how we needed to shift away from that. And in helping us to shift away from that, we looked at the work of Luis Mall, who's a Latinx scholar from the University of Arizona. And he talked about the funds of knowledge, those cultural resources that students and families and caregivers actually bring to our learning spaces. And then how we as educators should leverage those funds of knowledge, those assets, and those gifts to help make that learning environment richer and much more diverse in terms of the experience that kids will partake in for learning. And then we talked about how language really defines and reflects what we think. If we're thinking a particular kind of way, then our language is going to come out a certain way. And if we're internalizing language in a particular way, that also impacts our thinking. So language and thinking is a reciprocal process. It's an output and input mechanism on both ends. And then in terms of the activity that we engage in, through the lens of poverty, we talked about folks who experience poverty or housing insecurities. We talked about folks labeled from the middle class, and then folks who are affluent. And then we talked about the stereotypes and myths and assumptions of those students and families and caregivers in each of these three socioeconomic categories. And then just really had a really great and rich discussion about some stereotypes that we hung on to that may or may not be an accurate portrayal of the student, that may lead us to miss some things in terms of the care that we provide for kids, in terms of the learning that we design, and in terms of the curriculum that we even select for kids. And then from there, to help us dig a little bit more deeply into the work, we watched this particular video about a single mother and the things that she engaged in on a day-to-day basis to prioritize education for her kids. And using the lens of poverty, we were able to list a number of different assets that she demonstrated that could be leveraged by a school team had they taken the time to look at her through that perspective and then engage in proactive partnership with her. So we had some really rich conversation around that as well. And then we talked about what some of the research said relative to our assumptions about students and families who identify as experiencing poverty or housing insecurity. And some of that information was a lot from Paul Gorski, who's one of the leading national equity researchers in the country. He talked about parents who are low income have the exact same attitudes about education as parents who are wealthy. And so we spent a lot of time discussing that in our breakout groups and our activities together, and how we needed to lean more into that that disruption of that stereotype so that we can better partner with our families and provide better services for our kids. And then we also talked about dispelling this idea that schools can't do much of anything because of poverty, or that schools actually can't perpetuate poverty. And so we talked about the cycle of poverty and how schools are complicit in that cycle of poverty. And then we talked about how schools can be complicit in disrupting that cycle of poverty by really using and leveraging asset-based views of students and families and communities, and really providing kids with high supports that don't diminish the high expectations that we have of all kids. And so schools are actually very instrumental in the fight against poverty and in helping to use education as a vehicle of liberation for kids. So that was a quick review of that. And so we're going to jump back into breakout groups with one another. We're going to spend about 8 minutes on this. And so what we'd like for you to discuss this time is, what are the current stereotypes that we hear about children and families from certain identities or certain financial situations? And then how might we change language to disrupt deficit-based thinking that's not truly reflective of kids and their families and their care providers? So again, what are the current stereotypes that we hear about children and families from certain identities in our school settings, in our community settings? And then how might we change that language to disrupt the deficit thinking that's prevalent with those stereotypes?
And then when we come back, if you would like to share information out.
All right, so the next part of our learning tonight will be centered on engaging in identity development. And so we're going to take pretty much the entirety of the rest of our time tonight to dive deeply into this part of Cornerstone 1. And it's a very important module for a variety of reasons, and we'll unpack those significant reasons as we progress through the learning tonight, to sort of show you the relationship to why identity this particular module is a focus and a keystone for a lot of what we do in today's educational landscape. And so when we talk about identities, let's start with some definitional understanding and some grounding around what it is that we mean when we say identity or intersectional identities. And so when we look at identities across race, across class, gender, ability, sexual identity, gender identity, language, ethnicity, religion, and their intersections, no identity is fixed. No identity is set on a particular scale, and then that's the identity for the rest of your life. Each of these identities develop and evolve and manifest themselves across each of these spectrums and then the intersections of these spectrums. And those identities are formed by values, how one is raised, by the experiences in schools and in society, and a whole host of things that impact one's identity development. And so when we talk about identity, it's who we are as a person. And it is the aspects of ourselves that are most meaningful and most important. And so the first things that come to mind when we talk about identity are a lot of those things in which we have to classify ourselves to the rest of society. And so when we talk about gender, race, social class, language, religion, ethnicity, sexual and gender identities, ability, and all their intersections. The other ways in which we can think about and demonstrate and discuss identities are around like the particular roles that we take in our households, whether it's as a mother, as a husband, a wife, a partner, and what have you. Your identities can be distinguished by your geographic location or where you were born or what part of the region of the country you're from, or if you immigrated to this country. And so some folks identify themselves as a Southerner, some folks as Wisconsinites. For me, because I grew up in Chicago and in particular on the South Side, so I do identify as a South Sider from Chicago. And a lot of times I say I was raised as a kid with a funny name who was Black and who grew up on the South Side of Chicago. And so that tells you a lot about me that you need to know. And then also interests intersect with that too, how you identify from some of the things that give you joy in life, whether it's through sports and cooking and what have you. So for me, being a South Sider from Chicago, you could probably make the strong estimation that I am a Bears fan. So for all you Packer fans out there, you know, the wins that you stack up by beating the Bears will come to an end soon once Rodgers is no longer a Packer and Jordan Love is at the helm. So I'm looking forward to that day when the Bears can claim victory again. But don't hold that against me. Your identities can also be distinguished by other markers, whether it's your schooling identity, where you grew up, and some of the social institutions that you're a part of. It can be certain situations in family dynamics, like being a parent of a child with disabilities or being a cancer survivor. But the important thing here is that identities can shift and change over the course of our lives. And so when we talk about identities, it's important to understand these 8 observations. First, all of us have multiple identities, and all of us have identities of privilege and marginalization. Even as a Black man in this society, in our current socio-political environment, I still hold a ton of privilege. And the idea and the most present privilege for me that comes to mind is my male privilege. I get to move through society in a certain way and be judged and looked at in a certain way because of the privilege that I hold as a male. The second observation is we often experience contradictory urges about when we want to fit and be recognized based on our identities. The third observation is that some identities pay a higher price because of the history of marginalization, because of the structures and systems of deficit-based thinking practices and language, because of some of those factors, societal factors that folks themselves on an individual basis may not have control over. The fourth observation is that some people have a choice as to whether their identity stays hidden. Now let that one sit and sink for you. So some of us have a choice as to whether a certain identity that we hold stays hidden. The fifth one here is that individual identities are always changing and developing because of interactions, because of what we're learning, because of experiences, because of trauma, because of joys, because of a whole host of things. The development of an individual identity does not preclude the development of shared goals within a community. So the development of an individual identity does not preclude the development of shared goals with a particular community. Next, the more one understands their own identities, the more that they themselves can understand the identities of others. The more you know yourself, the more you know others. And then lastly, the more one understands identities and the construction of marginalization in society, the more one can lead to intentionally closing the access and opportunity gaps that far too often and far too many of our kids encounter on a day-to-day basis. And so when we think about identity development work, and in the context of the work within Oshkosh, eliminating inequities happens on several different levels. And so does identity development. And so that first happens at the individual level, getting to understand and know yourself first and foremost, before you can understand others. And so using that deeper analysis, that deeper examination, the deeper work of understanding who you are and your identities and their intersections, that helps you to examine and understand the institutions in which we reside, whether it's in our schoolhouses, in hospitals, in our police departments, and in a whole host of other societal institutions. And then we can better understand how that happens on a societal level, and understanding that marginalization and oppression happens on all three of these levels as well. And so it is upon us in our identity work and understanding and unpacking the history and understanding how our deficit-based thinking and language and practices help to perpetuate those things that we want to eliminate within society, within our schools. So the more that we can learn about ourselves and how we are positioned in these institutions, in society, in our communities, and then understand what tools that we have within us to work with one another to dismantle and eliminate these inequities, the better our communities, the better our schools, the better our society are better off because of that work. And so when we think about the work that the schools are engaged in here in Oshkosh, these aren't just steps that they go through and steps that you then can say, okay, we checked off this box, we know the history. Like, no, we have to constantly revisit these steps. And so everything that we do in Cornerstone 2 comes back to Cornerstone 1. Everything that we do in Cornerstone 3 comes back to Cornerstone 2 and Cornerstone 1. And everything that we do in Cornerstone 4, from a policy and funding and decision-making standpoint, that all is based on Cornerstone 3, 2, and 1. And so in this particular instance, when we're looking at identity, what role does that play for educators? Well, if we are to design learning experiences, select curriculum and materials and resources that are best suited to teach our kids and to give our kids the optimal learning experience, then we have to make sure that the identity development is happening on the individual and community level, so that when we are engaged in designing this work for our kids, that we're designing it the best way possible, that's free of bias, that's free of stereotypes, that's free of anything that might harm or diminish one's identity, and more importantly, their dignity and their humanity. So that's why we need to engage in this particular work. And so the initial learning on an adult level for the folks who are charged with being caretakers for our kids, first and foremost, we do this work to support all learners. You can't be a public school educator and not engage in identity development work, because we don't have a choice in who comes across our doors. We have to accept every kid that we come in contact with. Secondly, it happens through language and understanding that we can build an inclusive community. If that's our shared goal, if that's our shared desire, our aspiration, then we have to do the work. And it happens through changing language, through being intentional about the practices that we employ, and understanding how we are all part of this particular fabric of society. And it is not about teaching students, and it's more about creating a diverse normative through the language that we use and the lenses by which we view our students and families. And a particular example of this is just, the simple pronouns that we use to describe kids. So asking kids and folks that we come in contact with, what are your preferred pronouns that you want to use? Even when it comes along the lines of race, for myself, I'm not offended if I'm referred to as an African-American male or a Black male. My preference, though, is Black, but I'm not offended if you use African-American. But take the time to ask someone, what's your preference, whether it's pronoun or how they want to be described from a racial or ethnic standpoint. Just simply asking dignifies the person and raises to the surface that you care about their humanity and how they want the world to view them. So then the question is, how can I advance my own identity? Well, a few ways. And the most important way is through critical encounters that we have. And that happens first and foremost with the relationships with others different from oneself. So that starts with looking at, how we interact with students. What are the relationships that we're crafting and building with students? What are the relationships that we have with families and other families and community members, with our neighbors, with people that we work with? Are you proactively building a relationship with someone who's different than yourself? And then for educators, we ask them to do this through home visits, excuse me, through community and neighborhood walks or events. And then from a technical standpoint, are we engaging in practices that proportionally represent classrooms, that proportionally represent our kids in all classroom spaces and environments? Are we careful in making sure that we're not segregating kids by race, by income, by stereotypical ability? Are we examining how we are constructing our learning spaces and who we're placing in those spaces? And so when you learn about yourself and then you learn about someone else, that compels you to learn a little bit more about yourself, which in turn compels you to learn a little bit more about someone else. And so this is a particular cycle that we want to ignite and constantly engage in when we're working with people different from ourselves, and when we're charged with teaching and educating and providing services for kids and their families. And then just a quick note of caution here. So just because I have a friend or know someone who is different from me does not mean that I get it. So again, just because you have a friend or you know someone who is different from you does not mean that you get it. You haven't walked in their shoes, and you'll never really fully get it. But what you can build, what you can get, is empathy. You build your own internal locus of empathy for someone else. And then the second piece here is that it's not up to someone else who's different from us to teach us about those differences. We have to actively engage in the education ourselves. And so we do that through books, through movies, through other forms of media. We do it through workshops, whether it's through the United Way, through the Boys and Girls Club, through Neighborhood Club, whether it's something that's put on by the school community, by the administration, by the PTO group. And it also happens through regular, frequent conversations with people about race, about ability, about gender and sexual identities, about religion, language, social class, and their intersections. So what you're doing tonight, that's you advancing your own identity development. Then it also happens by teaching an identity relevant curriculum. And so asking our teachers, charging our teachers with the responsibility of providing our students with activities and experiences that value each and every student, families, the different constructions of families, and communities, and understanding that no two communities look the same. No two families look the same or are the same, and no two students are the same. We all have different things that make us individuals, that create different characteristics because of our heritage, because of our experiences, because of our backgrounds. And so it's important for us to understand that we have to design learning experiences that really raise the value and importance of diversity, of different identities, their intersections, and what it means to live in harmony with one another based on that mutual, genuine respect that's developed from seeing someone else and their humanity first, and not the stereotypes that we've been socially conditioned to believe in. So what we'd like for you to do next, in small groups again, is to discuss this simple question: why are identities important? And then have that discussion on two levels. On a personal level, why are identities important? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for someone else? And then secondly, on an educational level, why is identity development work important in schools and for our kids? So we'd like for you to.
And so this is one example. As you know, so Nassif went through all the examples by race, by social class, by ethnicity, by language, by religion, by ability, by gender, by sexuality, and their intersections. And we're not going to be able to get deep into intersections tonight, but the intersections are really important because, as he said, we all have identities of privilege and marginalization, but some of us have more identities of privilege and some of us have more identities of marginalization. So as a white female, my identity of privilege is very clear, being white, right? It's a significant privilege. My identity of marginalization, it sometimes is being female, right? So, and at the same time is my age. So I can't tell if my age works for me sometimes or works against me. But as I hit 60, right, my age is also an identity. And life changes. That's why identities aren't constant. And so but the intersection of those identities, and then my social class, I grew up in poverty. So my mother made $8,000 a year. But the intersection of those four identities, just as far as poverty and female, my age now, right, and being white, matter. It matters. It creates my whole unique experience. But it also, the importance of intersectionality can't be understated. So, hopefully we get to talk about that a little more as we continue on in our path, but also to make sure as you do your own work to think about the intersectionality of identities, especially the intersectionalities of identities of privilege and marginalization. And that's often where you might receive pushback in this conversation. Because someone experiencing poverty who's a white male might have two identities of privilege, white and male, but experiencing poverty is not a privilege, right? And so the pushback might come that he experiences poverty and nothing that just doesn't feel like anything about his life feels like it's privilege, or he's worked very hard for what he has, right? And so it's important to understand those intersections across those three identities as we're continuing our own understandings. So we're going to take a deep dive into gender identity. And we're going to just watch a quick video of kids talking about gender identity. And, but we could have this, we're not going to get to disability tonight, but we will do it on our day 4. But we could go to a deep dive around race. We could do a deep dive around, we did poverty by using the example during asset versus deficit, right? So we're going to do gender now. And then we're going to continue our walk on our 4th time together, and we'll do disability. And really thinking about those identities. So a little bit about gender. Gender is really the biological sex. So sex assigned at birth. So sometimes people confuse gender identity with sexual identity. So gender identity is one's innermost concept of how they see themselves, whether as a male or a female or non-binary, of neither male or female, right? And so it's how someone feels inside, right? So it's not the assigned sex or gender at birth, it is how someone feels inside. So gender expression is how they want to appear on the outside. And then gender nonconforming, which often may be identified as gender non-binary, gender neutral. So there's different terminology depending on the person, right? Or who's speaking. But we're going to watch a gender non-binary, gender neutral, gender non-conforming video of kids talking about that. But how I express myself matters, right? So how I express my gender on the outside, but who I am on the inside is how I identify myself on the outside. And then transgender is the body and brain mismatch, right? So transgender is really looking at my body might be one gender, but my brain is another gender. And so, and the change in clothing or gender expression isn't suitable. It's not enough, right? Because I still feel that mismatch. And so it takes it to the really understanding that biologically and genetically, I'm not representative of who I want to be, which is why we may be transgender female or transgender male, and it's always the identity you're moving to versus the identity you're moving away from. So just a little bit about that, but I want to be clear, these are pretty fluid. The language is fluid and it changes depending on who the individual is. And someone might find that gender nonconforming feels uncomfortable or disrespectful because nonconforming to what? And it would be nonconforming to that white cisgender able-bodied middle-class English speaking normative, right? So they might want to say, I'm just gender non-binary, right? I'm not going to go either one, or I am gender neutral, right? Or I'm going to gender expression. I'm going to express myself differently than my biological gender, right? So just thinking through the different identities, gender identities. So we're going to watch this video of kids talking about gender nonconforming. And I hope I don't have any hiccups with it. So I tried it. Oops. Let's see if this goes. Well, I'm going to actually just I'm going to bring it up on YouTube. And at times, my internet just has not worked well with holding a video, but let's see how it goes. All right, can everyone see my screen and you can see the video? Yeah.
Yes.
But I can't get it to move to full screen. So.
You share?
Is it too small to see?
It is.
Okay. If you could share, that'd be great.
Okay.
So, and we only have, so we'll probably end on this, and then we'll pick up with an identity, really thinking about our own identity inventory across identities. And so when we come back together on our last time together, we'll do an identity inventory where you can really think about where you might rate yourself across a range of identities between race, gender, sexuality, language, etc. Are you ready to go, Nassif? I thought maybe you were waiting for me to stop talking.
Yep, I'm ready. I'm gonna share. No, you were good.
But I'm holding you back. All right, here we go.
All right. You can see that okay?
Yep.
All right. Can you hear the sound?
We cannot. Can you share your sound?
Okay, let me try that again. Still nothing.
If a parent offers
Now
the
you're
option,
good.
you can play with this doll or you can play with this ball, and the boy chooses the ball, my theory is because early humans, like the men, as far as I'm concerned, hunted.
I mean, is there a reason why the men were the ones hunting?
Probably because they were stronger.
Hi, I'm Nanta.
Hi, I'm Willow.
Willow, nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Brianna.
Hey, Brianna, I'm Nanta. Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Okay, so can I start asking questions? Mom, you said think of some questions and be prepared. I'm prepared.
Do you know why we're here today?
Not really.
Not really. Okay.
I think it has something to do like gender non-binary.
Or non-conforming.
Yeah, both. Yeah, so gender non-conforming and non-binary.
What's gender non-conforming?
Well, what do you think it is?
Something
Make a
about
guess.
gender, because I hear the word gender in it.
Do I look like a girl to you?
Yes.
Well, what if I told you that sometimes, though, I feel more like a boy?
That's okay.
So binary, boy and a girl. So non-binary, meaning
The opposite.
yeah, exactly. That's a bunch of crock, right? You can be one end, the other end, or anywhere in between.
That's interesting.
But confusing.
So let's really start getting into some questions. Do you wish you were raised not as a girl but just an Nanta?
Yes, totally. It would have been great to just be marked like X gender, not boy, not girl. Coming into my own skin later in life would have been a lot more easier. Did you always know you're a girl?
Yeah.
Okay. Has that ever changed or for you or?
No.
No. How did you know you were a girl?
I feel it in my body.
Yeah.
I'm a boy, not a girl.
But people think he's a girl.
Oh, so people think you're a girl.
I've been called a girl, I think 309 times now. And I like my hair just how it is.
What makes a boy a boy?
An X and a Y chromosome.
Oh, so like, is there anything to name, like on the outside of somebody that makes them a boy?
Like,
Genitalia.
what?
Yeah.
No, that's also genetics, but like,
Well, yeah, but like that's on the outside. I'm just saying.
are we talking about like
Like looking or
Emotions.
like emotional or like hormonal or like genetical?
or like feelings? Like,
Genetical.
I don't know where we're going. Like,
Yeah, I don't either.
Have you ever heard about like how people try to say like pink is a girl thing, and then like how blue is like a boy color?
Yeah, I hear about that, even though blue is one of my favorite colors.
Yeah, right. So you see how confusing that could feel like when
Yeah.
it's like, I want to do this and that.
if a parent offers the option with no bias, hey, you can play with this doll or you can play with this ball, and the boy chooses the ball, my theory is because early humans, like the men, as far as I'm concerned, hunted. And so it's sort of like genetically men preferred things that moved around. I don't know, that's like completely a theory in terms of,
I mean, is there a reason why the men were the ones hunting?
probably because they were stronger.
And I think that's where I kind of like, oh, really? Well, I'm strong. Why can't I be a hunter too?
Well, yeah, but like in terms of like muscle mass, men have like, and I mean, they probably weren't thinking about that.
Does your family ever get mad at you for what you want to identify?
Oh yeah. I think it's different now that I'm an adult. But growing up, my mom would force me to wear a dress that I don't really want to wear.
I don't really like wearing dresses or skirts too, so I feel really uncomfortable when I'm like wearing the skirt.
Yeah. But did you get to choose your outfit today?
No.
So you know exactly how I feel then.
Yeah.
How do you know if somebody's gender nonconforming? Is it okay to ask somebody what their gender is?
So it's a lot better to ask about the person's pronouns.
That would be like he or she or they.
Right. Versus if I said,
What's your gender?
yeah, what's your gender? Are you a boy or are you a girl?
Seems like you're very interested in knowing.
So have you ever been confused by using they, them as a pronoun for someone?
I mean, sometimes it can be confusing, but I also have to remember that that's the pronouns that they've chosen, and I need to respect that. I've noticed someone in my class, first period, has the pronouns that they would like on their backpack.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool. I've been to the Philippines.
Oh, I like the Philippines.
Oh, you've been there too?
Yeah.
That's where my family's from. And
Where my mom's from.
okay, they use the term siya. So siya is like all encompassing of every gender, you know?
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
There's a girl who works at my tutoring center and she goes by they, them, and then a lot of times, like I just didn't call her she, and then I'm like, oh wait, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Did she ever, or sorry, see, even I made that mistake. Do they ever address it with like, or correct people who may use a different pronoun for them?
No, but somebody else might.
How does being non-binary affect your day-to-day life?
Looking for a job. There's times where like, before going into an interview, I totally just want to wear like these slacks and like a button-up shirt, but will it be more likely to get the job if I wore like a dress suit or something, you know?
Why is gender such a big deal?
You know, sometimes I wish it really wasn't. How do you feel about, is it a big deal to you?
No, I just figure like, why can't they just be a person? Like,
Yeah. Do you all think gender is a big deal?
No. Well, I mean, like if someone was identified as neither boy nor girl, it's not a big deal to me if they were in between, but like gender is a big part of who you are.
That's real, yeah. Thanks. Do you like handshakes?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
All right. I think we can probably skip the handshake, but lovely as it is. So we only have a few minutes, and so I'm just going to do a wrap up, even though we'll pick up where we left off with identities. But I'll just do a quick wrap up, and then Nasifa is going to go ahead and put our resonates and pauses in chat. And then know when you come back the next time, we'll do an identity inventory. Kim, I think I'm going to ask you to send it out ahead of time so that those who want to print it out and have a hard copy do.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we would have just put the Word document in chat today, but since we don't have time, it might be a better way to do it. So just thinking about gender, and it's often an identity we don't talk a lot about. We thought the video it's how kids see it. Right? It's how they talk about it. And it's not assuming, right? So just, we can't assume someone's gender. And so as we change language, what we talk about in the schools is as we change our language, then we actually create that diverse normative that we don't have to teach specifically about gender identity. We just make sure we include all genders, right? And so as we go forward, we want to think about our language. Can we use they, them more often than he, she? Not lining kids up by boys and girls, but maybe colors, primaries and not primaries, odd numbers and even numbers. There's lots of ways to line up kids, but we don't have to line up by gender, because inevitably someone doesn't feel seen when we use language like that. So this is about the adult work and the adults changing their language in order to have a greater landscape. So it's kind and loving and respectful, and caring to ask about pronouns. And then it's okay to ask a person what their pronouns are, as you heard in the video. And then again, just the example that we talk about in classrooms, to move a little bit to gender neutral, so that kids that are questioning or wondering can be seen and heard and not feel excluded within our school situation. So we're sorry that our time is up, and I don't want to hold you past our time. There are a couple great books, and we try to give recommendations. So this is Becoming Nicole. And it's a book about a child who is transgender in a religious family, and transgender female. So it's about becoming Nicole. So it's absolutely a beautiful book, and how the family struggled because of religious beliefs. We thought maybe you might be interested in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Nassif, and then back to Kim and Brian to close us out. We want to thank you for your time tonight, and we really look forward to getting together next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Elise. And everyone, I placed the link in the chat for you. So as always, what resonated with you tonight and what gave you some pause. And we actually use that feedback to help design our learning for the following session. So again, thank you so much for your time tonight, for the conversations, for the vulnerabilities, and just for leaning into the discomfort. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Davis, Dr. Brown, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us again. We do appreciate it. Our next meeting is on December 6th, so I will send a calendar invite to you, so you have that on your calendar in plenty of time. So.
Yes, and finally, just thanks everyone for participation. I think multiple times tonight, it was evident that this is important work to be done in schools, but it also takes a community. And so your involvement at a community level is critical to the success of the schools, and our ability to grow together is critical. And this space is a really good time to do that. So thanks everyone for your continued commitment, and look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great night.
Have a great evening, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you.
Elise?